Got some mass drop Holy Pandas.
Have Holy Panda case switches.
And this is the review of the Holy Pandas switches, one of the most sought after tactile switches on the market today.
Their Holy Panda switch that was first made by Quakeums and named by myself.
Panda switch, the Halo switch, Halo Panda, Holy Panda, it's genius.
I do happen to have some real deal polar pandas in house today.
These are the glorious pandas.
Hello and welcome to this review of my Holy Panda switches.
How are Holy Pandas born?
Yep, you guessed it. It's panda time. If you've been anywhere near the custom keyboard hobby in the last couple of years, you probably heard about these elusive, almost magical tactile switches by now. Today, we are going to give an in-depth look, IOSAM style, at three variants of these keyboard switches, or Franken switches if you will. The Invyr Holy Panda, the Holy Yok Polar Panda, and the recently released Glorious Panda. By the end of this video, you will know all the relevant information about them and if any of these switches is actually worth your money for your next keyboard build, or if you could do better with other types of tactile switches out there. Hello and welcome to IOSAM. My name is Sam Franco, and this is a channel where I do tech reviews and show you how to build, fix, and mod all sorts of computer gear. Today we are pitting three of the most popular versions of the Holy Panda switches against each other and comparing their characteristics, quality, prices, availability, and everything else that makes these switches supposedly so special. As usual, I will break everything into chapters in the description below with their respective time codes as well as their progress bars on the top and bottom of the screen to help you navigate to any specific part of the video. So let's start by explaining what is a Holy Panda. How did these switches came about and why or if you should care. The Holy Panda was originally a Franken switch, meaning a switch that is made by mixing parts of two or more different switches to achieve a feel that can be described as a large, rounded, tactile bump that starts on the very top of the stem trajectory, giving the switch a very peculiar tactile feel that is way more pronounced than what you'd get with a regular Cherry MX Brown and with a Cherry MX Clear, which were incidentally the two main tactile switch options you had around the time when the Holy Panda concept was born. The original Holy Panda was invented or discovered, depending on how you look at it, around late 2017, early 2018, when Brian, aka Quake MZ from Top Clack fame, which is a mechanical keyboards blog/streaming show that I'll leave a link below if you want to check it out, decided to place the stem of a Halo tactile switch prototype, which was being developed at the time by a group called the Input Club, into the housing of an Invyr Panda linear switch. A switch that had been released in 2017 to a very lukewarm reception by the Mac community at the time. On their own, both the Invyr Panda and the Input Club Halo were considered as relatively unsuccessful attempts at innovating linear and tactile switches respectively. But the magic really happened once you mixed their parts the way Brian did. Now, all of a sudden, you had what was considered by many as the most incredible feeling tactile switch ever devised by anyone until then. The whole history of the original Holy Panda is pretty interesting actually, and if you're like me and enjoy reading about this kind of product development drama, I highly recommend you check out Brian's own account of how the whole thing came about on the Top Clack link I'll leave on the description below. And drama is indeed the right word to describe the whole story and the amount of clones spawned by it. If you want to learn more about all the different Holy Panda variations and clones, you should also check this very detailed article by Theramine Gold called the Pandaverse, where he documented no less than 20 of those. I'll leave a link for this one in the description below as well. At any rate, in this video we'll focus on the three main variations of the Holy Panda concept, and that were arguably the most popular ones until now. Starting with the Invyr Holy Panda, this was until recently the closest thing you could get to the original Holy Panda until Drop.com started to sell their Drop Invyr Holy Panda on a more permanent basis since early 2020. But these are basically the same thing, namely the housing and the spring of an Invyr Panda, a version 3 in this case, with the stem of a Halo True. The Invyr's top housing is made of polycarbonate and the bottom is nylon. The Halo stem seems to be made of polyoxymethylene, also known as POM, although I could not find an official confirmation about it from the manufacturer anywhere on the web. The Invyr housing, as is the case with the other two switches we'll check out today, are plate mounted, meaning they don't have the two extra smaller plastic pins that give additional stability to PCB mounted switches, such as the ZOPC Xylence I'm showing here. The Holy Pandas I'm using for this review, I actually built old style, after ordering 90 Invyr Pandas V3 for $52.75 in late 2019 and 90 Halo Trues for $45 in early 2020, both from drop.com, and then proceeded to open them all with a KBD fan switch opener and then separate their individual parts before I could lube and assemble each individual switch. As mentioned before, you can now order Drop Holy Pandas pre-assembled and supposedly unlubed directly from drop.com for about 10 cents more per switch than what I paid when I bought the Pandas and Trues separately. The prices are currently between $1.14 and $1.21 per switch depending on the batch size you choose, 70, 90, or 110 units. The positive side of that is the considerable amount of time you save by not having to assemble the switches yourself, of course. Not to mention that in this point in 2020, I have not seen Invyr Pandas for sale anywhere in the web for a very long time, so buying pre-assembled Holy Pandas from Drop might be your only option to get your hands on this version of these switches nowadays anyway. One of the first practical things to know about Holy Pandas in general is that you should lube them. Although Holy Pandas tend to sound nice, they are not particularly smooth in their stock form. So in order to really experience these switches in all their glory, they definitely need to be lubed properly. And I say properly because when Drop started selling the pre-assembled Holy Panda directly, these were being pre-lubed from the factory. But as many reviewers at the time pointed out, the factory lubing was messy and very inconsistent. So in their 2020 batches of Holy Pandas, Drop promised to sell these switches completely dry to allow buyers to lube the switches themselves and possibly do a better job than they did. At any rate, my 2019 Drop Invyr Pandas did come pre-lubed, although I can confirm that the lube coating was very thin and much better applied than with the 2019 batch of Holy Pandas they sold. When analyzing both the switch housing and the leaf spring on my microscope, I could clearly see the lube coating. Same thing on the stamps, which left a thin lube residue on the container I was placing them during assembly. But here I got the impression that the lube was not manually applied, given the fact that it was evenly distributed, but I can't verify that, of course. The fact that the leaf spring came lubed from the factory might have influenced how these switches sounded even before I applied my own Krytox mix to it, which is to say they didn't produce any unpleasant noises. For lubing the Invyr Panda, I used my usual mix of 50% Krytox 205 grade 2 grease and 50% Krytox 105 oil, for a mix that is essentially the same thing as Krytox 205 grade 0. And in case you're wondering, the reason I do my own Krytox mix is simply because it is way cheaper to buy the 205 grade 2 and the 105 in bulk and then mix them myself than buying the 205 grade 0 at retail, since you cannot buy the 205 grade 0 in bulk very easily. Besides, when mixing the thicker grease and oil versions myself, I have the option to make the mix thicker or thinner depending on the application. Here, I lubed each switch individually using a jeweler pickup tool and a number 2 nylon hair brush, applying a thin coat on the rails, the center barrel, and the floor of the bottom housing. I did not lube the leaf spring, since as I mentioned before, it already had a thin lubricant layer pre-applied from the factory anyway. In my particular Holy Panda build, I also decided to replace the original Invyr coil spring with a supposedly higher quality aftermarket Sprit 63 grams one to see if I could improve the feel of the switch somehow. I decided to do that after testing the original springs that came with the switch and not really liking the slightly crunchy feel that some of them gave. Although, the stock springs can have that issue mostly fixed by some proper lubing. To lube the coil springs, I held them with an angled tweezer and brushed a generous amount of lube on both extremes and on the middle with horizontal and vertical swipes. I don't like to bag lube springs because that process ends up wasting too much lube, which, if you're using Krytox, is not exactly cheap. But of course, lubing springs individually will take a lot more time and effort. Next, I lube the halo stems, holding them with the jeweler pickup tool by the cross keycap plug on the top, and then proceeded to lube all 4 sides. Notice that I did not lube the stem legs directly in this case, since there was enough factory pre-applied lube in the area of the leaf spring that will interact with the stem's legs. And last, I lubed the top housing. You don't necessarily have to lube the top housing. In fact, most people I know don't do it. But in my experience, lubing the top housing seems to lower the pitch of the upstroke sound, which is something I particularly appreciate. To lube the top housing, you can start by the two capped deeper rails on the sides, brushing a thin coating along them, and then brushing the remaining two sides. To finish assembling the switch, I slid the top housing on top of the bottom part, with the spring and the stem already placed, with everything still resting on the key switch opener. As for the typing feel of my assembled Invyr Holy Pandas, this is the classic Holy Panda feel. No surprises here, of course. With the generous lubing I've done here, their tactility feels rounded and smooth with just a slight hint of pre-travel. With the Korean Sprit 63-gram springs I used, they feel slightly lighter than with the stock ones. And I'm happy to report that properly lubed, these springs produce no ping that I could easily detect. The Invyr's bottom and top housings are not as tight as the other two switches in this roundup, as we'll see later. So for that reason, I ended up also filming them with Kibo switch films to fix that issue. Although on the main typing test you'll see later, these switches were not filmed yet to avoid changing its sound profile too much for this comparison. As for filming switches, by which I mean applying these thin plastic films between the top and the bottom housings of the switch, I usually only do it when I feel they are wobbly enough to make the sound too plasticky, hollow, or high pitch. And while I wouldn't go to the extreme to say that that's what I felt with the stock Invyr Pandas, I can definitely confirm that the films improved the sound by lowering the pitch a notch or two. As for stem wobble, while the Invyr is a bit worse than the other two switches, I can't see anything out of the ordinary here. At least to me, I'd say you will not have any problems using taller keycap profiles such as SA or MT3. While these switches were considered the most tactile ones when they came about a few years back, I think we can safely state that this is no longer the case today, with the advent of other sharper and super tactile switches such as ZOPC's Zelius V2 and Novel Key's Blueberries, among others. Having said that, I'm also confident that the level of tactility of the classic Invyr Holy Panda is enough for the large majority of people out there, and I'd even say that anything beyond this level can actually start to feel uncomfortable to some people. In my personal opinion, the classic Invyr Holy Panda is, and is likely to continue to be, not only relevant, but possibly the preferred tactile switch to most enthusiasts out there. Here's a quick key spamming sound test of stock, lubed/spring swapped, and lubed/spring swapped and filmed Invyr Holy Pandas on a stock Novel Keys NK65 entry edition. Next, we'll cover the Holy Yok Polar Panda. Yok Pandas were one of the panda clones that came about the same time the demand for the original Holy Pandas and some of their follow-up clones, such as the Bison G-Sus Pandas, was sky high in early 2019. These were commissioned and co-developed by Novel Keys and produced by Bison, the same Chinese manufacturer of all versions of the Invyr and G-Sus Pandas. The main differentiator with the Yok Pandas were the different color schemes such as red, mint, black, and blue, a lighter 60-gram spring, and the fact that Novel Keys was able to keep them in stock for a very long time. As for the materials, they used the exact same formula from the Invyrs: polycarbonate top housing and nylon bottom. I was able to buy 90 units of the Yok Polar Pandas, polar here being the name for the blue collar ones, at Novel Keys in September 2019 without any issues for $53.86 including shipping. The cost to build 90 Holy Yok Polar Pandas was $98.86, including the price of 90 Halo Clears, which was about the same price I paid for the parts for my Invyr Holy Pandas. The assembly process to build a Holy Panda with Yok switches is basically the same with Invyr Pandas. I opened both batches of Yok Polar Pandas and Halo Clears and separated their parts before lubing. And in case you're wondering what is the difference between Halo Clears and Halo Trues, and if it makes any difference choosing between one or the other when building Holy Pandas, the answer to the first question is the springs. Halo Trues have linear springs, but with a much heavier actuation and bottom-out weights that end up obfuscating some of the tactility of the switch. They have an actuation force of 54 grams and a bottom-out force of 100 grams. The Halo Clears, on the other hand, have lighter springs with slightly different force increase, with an actuation force of 52 grams and a bottom-out force of 78 grams. Although the term progressive here might seem a bit exaggerated, since the spring does not increase exponentially by the end of the travel. Instead, it just starts with a lower threshold force than the Halo Trues. But both Halos True and Clear seem to have the deliberate goal of dissuading you from bottoming out when typing. Which brings us back to the second question, if it makes any difference choosing between Halo Clear or True for your Holy Pandas, to which the answer is, it depends. It certainly doesn't make any difference in the tactile feel, since both Halos True and Clear have exactly the same shaped stems, just with different colors. But it can make a difference if you decide to use the springs that come with the Halo switch of your choice instead of using the Invyr or Yok stock springs. While the Halo True spring is considered too heavy by most people and Halo Clear springs is a bit unconventional with its different force increase, you can surely try your Holy Pandas with these springs to see if you like them with these heavier or progressive springs, of course. As for the lubing process here, it was exactly the same as with the Invyr Pandas. Although in this case, I used the stock springs that came with the yokes, which, at least in my copies, felt nice at around 60 grams bottom-out force and sounded pretty good in my opinion. Oh, and the yokes also came with a thin pre-applied lube coating on the switch housing and leaf spring. Although, when looking at it in the microscope, it seems that the coating is a bit thinner than what I got on my Invyrs. The typing feel of the Holy Yok Panda is still unquestionably, well, Holy Panda. You get the same rounded bump on the very top of the stem trajectory with the same satisfying key press, feedback, and rebound. Although in my opinion, I feel the Holy Yok Panda to be ever so slightly more tactile, nothing drastic, but enough to be noticeable. Initially I thought that this could be the result of its lighter spring, accentuating its tactility. But even after replacing the Invyr stock springs with lighter 63 grams ones, they still didn't feel as tactile as the yokes. So maybe it might just be a difference in its leaf spring. But my favorite aspect of the Holy Yok Panda is the sound. It has a lower pitch sound profile that I find to be more pleasant. One of the possible reasons for its lower pitch sound might be the fact that its housing is very tight. Unlike with the Invyr, I see no reason to film these switches. Stem wobble seems perfectly fine here as well. While these switches were considered for a while as a second-tier Holy Panda, for those who were not fortunate enough to grab original Invyr housings during the Holy Panda craze of 2018, I can confidently say today that that was an unfair characterization of the Holy Yok Pandas. In my humble opinion, the Holy Yok Panda, when properly lubed, is actually slightly better than the Invyr version, namely because it's tighter housing, nicer stock springs, and sound profile. But that is a totally subjective opinion, of course. On a blind test, I'd say 90% of people would not be able to tell the difference between them. Here's a quick key spamming sound test of both stock and lubed Holy Yok Polar Pandas on the same stock Novel Keys NK65 entry edition. And finally, we have the Glorious Panda, formerly known as the Glorious Holy Panda. And that name change has to do with these switches' own share of drama when they came out around September of 2020. The whole story is long enough to fill another video, so I'll just leave a link to my own blog post documenting the story and my own opinions about the whole thing, as well as another article by Theramine Goat with some interesting inside information down in the description below. But the resumed version goes more or less like this. In late August 2020, Glorious PC Gaming Race announces that they are releasing their own version of the Holy Panda Switch, after having procured the same Invyr Beeson original manufacturing molds and tooling, and that these switches would be readily available in their online store without the need to join group buys, and that they would cost significantly less than Drop's Invyr Holy Pandas at around 70 cents per switch compared to Drop's $1.20. While most members of the Mac community, namely the Mechanical Keyboard subreddit, were excited to have another source of readily available Holy Pandas for lower prices than Drop, the question about Gloria's authority to call their Switch a Holy Panda immediately surfaced. You see, the reason for the Holy moniker in the Holy Panda's name is the use of Halo Switch's stems. You know, the halo floating on top of the Holy Saint's head. So the question immediately was if Gloria's would use actual Halo Switch stems to make their pandas holy. Which, for anyone who knows anything about Drop.com, the entity who owns the rights for the Halo Switch's name and manufacturing, it was a very unlikely scenario. As a result, Glorious came out and clarified that they would not use Halo Switch stems, but would instead be using a similar stem of their own design. According to Glorious' own marketing material, a new and improved Glorious stem that provides less pre-travel for the tactile bump to occur and a stronger upward stroke, composed of palm, sourced from Japan. Which I can confirm as being a true statement. Glorious Pandas have indeed less pre-travel than the Invyr Holy Pandas and are also snappier on the rebound. Then, to add more drama to the whole story, it became public that Glorious was filing a trademark on the commercial use of the name Holy Panda. So, as one can imagine, chaos and revolt ensued on the Mac community on Reddit. Then, a few days later, Glorious founder Shazim Mohammed came out publicly on Reddit apologizing for the disingenuous use of the name Holy and their attempt to trademark the Holy Panda name. They subsequently pulled their trademark application for the name, which was immediately followed by Drop's own filing to trademark it, of course. And, as a direct consequence, only the first batches of Glorious PC Gaming Race's new switches would come with the Glorious Holy Panda name on their packaging, and subsequent production batches would be called only Glorious Panda, which for a lot of people, me included, is actually a much better name. Okay, but enough of history lessons. What about the switches, you might be asking? Well, there are both good and bad news. Let's start with the good. The first one being, of course, the availability and price. which at the time of this video in late 2020 is still back ordered and being shipped to people who pre-ordered it in the last couple of months, but the Glorious promised to keep these switches in stock indefinitely, beginning at some point in late 2020, early 2021. So, for everybody who had to wait months to get their hands on Drops Holy Pandas for a higher price, this is indeed very good news. One other notable difference is the way Glorious is selling these. They come in packs of 36, which is a different way to sell keyboard switches, if compared to how most online shops have been doing it until now, namely selling them in multiples of 10, which to me is fine, since you can cover a 60 or 65% board with 2 packs in a 75% TKL or full-size board with 3 packs. The second is that the switch indeed feels like a proper Holy Panda. It has a few important differences that we'll get to later, but overall, on a blind and def test, most people would never be able to tell the difference between Glorious Pandas and Invyr or even Yok Holy Pandas. They are made with the same materials than Invyrs and Yoks, polycarb top and nylon bottom, and follow the same basic design. The Glorious palm stem measures pretty much exactly like the halo stems used to make the other 2 Holy Pandas, as you can see on these measurements taken with my microscope, despite having slightly different shapes in the keycaps plug, the bottom shaft, and the tactile legs. Unlike with my Invyrs and Yoks, the Glorious Pandas came completely dry. No trace of lube anywhere here, which is great news, since you can lube these the way you like it. Like the Yok, but unlike the Invyr, the Glorious Pandas have very tight housings, so I saw no reason to film these either. And, as with the other 2 switches, I didn't see any major issues with stem wobble here. Its stock springs look very similar in shape and size to the Invyr springs. I'd say the Glorious Panda has about the same perceived tactility of the Invyr, maybe a bit rounder when lubed. Honestly, it's very hard to tell the difference between them. And just like the Invyrs, the Glorious bump is a tad bit less sharp than the Yoks. But again, we're basically splitting hairs here. Now, for the not so good news about this switch. As some other reviewers and members of the Mac community have pointed out, the Glorious Panda has a particular leaf spring tick noise or ping that could be a problem to some users. The most notable of such reviewers being Nathan Kim from Teha Types fame, who also clearly showed this leaf spring noise in one of his recent streams.
Like, the pinging's bad. Do you guys hear the ping? And that's with the leg. That's with pretty much all the parts being lubed on the Switch. And out of the batch of 72, I had 12 switches exhibit unfixable levels of ping.
The problem with leaf spring noise is that it is a bit more difficult to fix than regular coil spring ping. If you lube the coil spring with a heavy coating of Krytox or Tribosis, you can fix its ping noise 90% of the times without necessarily altering the feel of the switch, but not so much with the leaf spring. While you can lube the leaf spring and effectively kill any unpleasant noise coming out of it, this will definitely change the tactility of the switch to some extent, which might be a problem to some people. But then, to be fair to Glorious Pandas, at least in my comparison here, both my Invyrs and Yoks came with their leaf springs slightly pre-lubed from the factory, as I showed before, which could very well explain why their leaf springs don't seem to have the same tick or ping noises that we hear on the Glorious Panda. And also goes to show that lubing leaf springs to fix such noises is not exactly the ultimate sin of tactile switches, as some people might try to convince you. Besides, Holy Pandas in general have more than enough tactility that even if you lube the stem legs and the leaf spring, it will still feel way more tactile than your average MX Brown, if it's any consolation. So, at the end of the day, it's not really that big of a deal, but just something you need to be aware of, since lots of mechanical keyboard enthusiasts out there will rather throw their tactile switches away than lube the stem legs and smooth out their tactile bump. But as we all know by now, these things always boil down to preference anyway. So here, I decided to take one for the team and lube the leaf springs in my 2 batches of Glorious Pandas to see if I could fix the problem. just a word of advice. If you are one of those users who get triggered by seeing tactile switch stem legs and leaf springs being heavily lubed, you might want to skip this next chapter. The process to lube the Glorious Panda was, for the most part, the same one I did with the Invyrs and Yoks, except that in this case, I decided to try one of those acrylic lubing stations. I got this M Stone branded one from drop.com for $29.75. Here, I also applied a generous Krytox mix coating on the bottom housing side rails, center well, and floor, as well as on the springs, the stems, and on the top housing. And this is how the switch sounds after getting the same lube treatment I gave to the other two pandas. As you can probably tell, the leaf spring tick noise is fairly easy to pick up even on the regularly lubed Glorious Panda. Then, as promised, I also lubed the Glorious Panda's leaf spring by applying a generous coating of Krytox mix under the fold, in between the two metal leaves, and also in between the leaf spring and the opposing side metal contact that closes the circuit of the switch. As a side note, you should be aware that lubing the leaf spring's electrical contacts can cause problems such as switch misfire and chatter, depending on lubricant viscosity and quantity between the two metal contacts. If that happens, you can always use a clean brush to remove the excess lubricant between the metal contacts to fix the problem. And this is how the switch sounds after that additional step. And here's a quick key spamming sound test of both stock and spring leaf lube Glorious Pandas on the same stock Novel Keys NK65 entry edition. The sound difference is fairly noticeable. In fact, one could argue that the fully lubed Glorious now sounds even better than the previous two Pandas. But the tactility is now a tad smoother than what I have on my lubed and spring-swapped Invyr, and as a result, considerably less tactile than my lubed Yok Holy Pandas, which was already the most tactile switch of the bunch to begin with. So let's do a comparison typing test between the lubed Invyrs, Yoks, and Glorious Pandas on a stock Novel Keys NK65 entry edition. Okay, let's stop this for a second. I can't stand that stock NK65 spacebar rattle any longer. I'll be right back. Alright, that should do it now. Let's try that again. Ah, yeah, much better. And by the way, if you want to see in more details how I tune the stabs of my NK65 entry edition, please subscribe to this channel. My full review and modding of the NK65 is coming in the next few days. Alright, moving on to my conclusion out of this comparison between Invyr, Yok, and glorious Holy Pandas. Considering that at the time this video was recorded, you can no longer, as far as I know, buy new Yok Pandas anywhere, the Holy Yok Pandas are basically out of the question at this point, unless you're willing to get them used on Reddit's Mac Market. So, between buying drops Invyr Holy Pandas for over $1.20 per switch, and buying glorious pandas for around 70 cents per switch in batches of 36, I have to give the glorious the advantage here. There's also the fact that when you buy something from drop, you don't always receive it immediately. Their turnaround time for shipping these switches has been all over the place this year. So we can't really consider drop as an in-stock source for these switches anyway. And the situation with glorious is, at least for the time being, still not ideal either, since if you have not pre-ordered these switches in September, you'll probably only be able to get them sometime in late 2020 or possibly even early 2021. So for availability, I'd say drops Invyr and glorious pandas are basically a tie for the time being. But at least we have the promise from both vendors to keep these switches in stock indefinitely, which is great. But remember, prices in this hobby can and do fluctuate a lot, and products availability are almost impossible to predict, especially after everything that happened in 2020 and its effects on the global production and logistics chains. So it's always wise to temper your expectations with these things. Now, for the comparison between these switches' typing, feel, and sound, that is a fairly subjective thing, of course. For my particular taste, I think the Holy Yok Pandas I built strike the best balance between tactility and sound. The Yoks I bought last year came with good coil and leaf springs, so no complaints here as well. I have these Yok Polar Pandas ready for an upcoming keyboard project, so be sure to subscribe if you don't want to miss that one. As for the Invyr Holy Pandas I built, while technically not the same thing as buying pre-assembled drop Holy Pandas now, I have to assume they are similar enough that I think I can lump them together here. Sure, I swapped the springs for a lighter and smoother feel, but that doesn't mean that the stock springs that come with the Invyrs are bad. As long as you lube them well, they'll work perfectly fine. As a visual comparison of the springs, here you can see the stock Yok 60 grams, the stock Invyr 67 grams, the Sprit 63 grams, and the stock Glorious 67 grams side by side. Visually, I'd say the Yok and the Sprit springs look almost identical, while the Invyr and the Glorious springs seems very similar. As the middle ground tactility switch of the bunch, I think the Invyr Holy Pandas might also be the easiest ones for most people to enjoy and quickly adapt to. When properly lubed, they also feel and sound amazing, even if they sound a bit higher pitched than the Holy Yok Pandas, which is something I was able to fix by applying switch films to them anyway. But the bottom line is, I can wholeheartedly recommend these switches for anyone looking for a perfect balance between tactility, smoothness, sound, and availability. The only real problem I can see with these switches is the price. which at around $1.20 each is just too expensive nowadays, especially considering your other options for tactile switches, which we'll discuss in a bit. As for the plans for my Invyr Holy Pandas, they'll go on another very interesting project coming to this channel soon, where I'll transform a classic Japanese brand of production mechanical keyboards into something very special. So, stay tuned. And that brings us to the newest entry in the Holy Pandas ring, the Glorious. In terms of price, these are easy to recommend. While you certainly can buy other good tactile switches for less than what Glorious is asking for these, the difference is small enough to not matter too much, especially if Glorious makes good in its promise to keep these in stock indefinitely. Now for the feeling and sound, and this might be the tricky part. The Tactility is perfect. It is a tiny bit rounder than the Invyr and a tiny bit weaker than the Yok, but not enough to make it better or worse than the other two switches in that regard. I think it depends on who you are, how picky you are about tactility, sound profile, how willing you are to mod switches, and possibly most importantly, if you consider lubing leaf springs on tactile switches a sacrilege or not. If you're coming from regular production boards and is considering picking some Glorious Pandas for your first build, I'd say you're good to go here. These will feel and even sound better than pretty much any production board with regular Cherry, Gateron, KO, or Ultimo switches out there. And if you're willing to lube them, they'll feel and sound even better, of course. So for beginners, this is an easy recommendation. On the other hand, if you're a more experienced and pickier mechanical keyboard enthusiast, then you have to weight the issues with the leaf spring noise and your views on lubing tactile switches leaf springs to fix their noise while losing some of their tactility. In my particular case, I can live with that trade-off, especially considering the price and availability of these switches. For the time being, I am very happy with my fully lubed Glorious Pandas in my now tuned Novel Keys NK65 Entry Edition. In fact, I should say these switches and this budget little 65% keyboard are a match made in heaven, if you take the time to mod them properly, that is. Having said all that, should anyone looking for a good tactile switch at this point in late 2020, early 2021, still consider Holy Pandas at these prices? Honestly, I'm not so sure. Again, it will largely depend on who you are and where you're coming from in the world of custom mechanical keyboards. Strictly speaking on price for decent tactile switches, I'd say Holy Pandas are no longer worth their inflated prices, notwithstanding Glorious' valiant effort to bring these prices down. The number of options for good, cheaper, and more easily available tactile switches is now big enough that unless you really want to have a piece of custom mechanical keyboard history in your collection, you can safely skip Holy Pandas and go for any of the dozens of JWK variations of tactile switches out there, such as the excellent Durock T1s or Koalas, for example, that come slightly pre-lubed and are always on stock on Durock's store on AliExpress and can be bought for 55 cents per switch. If you want a more exclusive version of a JWK tactile, the Key.co has their C-cubed equals Kiwi switches, which is also highly sought after by tactile switch lovers, and they usually drop a batch every month or two on average at 65 cents each. Also, if you're looking for some super sharp tactile switches, look no further than Novel Keys Blueberries for 65 cents a piece. Or even the king of smooth tactiles from ZUPC, the Zelius V2. Zelius are not cheap, of course, but at least One Up Keyboards has been doing a phenomenal job in keeping these in stock throughout 2020. Zeo also offers their silent version of the Zelius, the Xylence, that I used on my budget silent keyboard build on my previous video, which you can check out on the link I'll leave in the description below and also on the card up here. So again, now you have options. While I love my little collection of Holy Pandas, I'd have no problem in recommending these other tactile switches for both custom keyboard veterans and for those just getting started on this hobby. And that brings us to the end of this one, folks. As usual, if you made it this far, I would like to thank you for watching the second video on this still very new YouTube channel. If you like what you saw here, please remember to leave a good old thumbs up on your way out. And if you enjoy this type of content, make sure you subscribe, because the number of interesting projects coming to this channel is getting bigger every day. Seriously, I think I might have way too many projects lined up for this channel already. As always, if you want to see not only gear reviews, but also DIY projects like builds, mods, fixes, hacks, and restorations of computer peripherals in general, always with a special focus on the budget side of things, you should most definitely stay tuned to this channel. Thank you again, and see you all soon.